All right. But yeah, thanks so much for being here. This is our 2025 budget town hall where we'll be briefed by Geoffrey Cubbage, who's here from the Federal Government Association, on the proposed budget for 2026, how the budget works, what's proposed for this year, and then we'll take questions and things like that. So we'll pass it over to the Alderwoman. Lenny, take it away.
Thanks, Audrey. Hi, everyone. Alderwoman Lenny Manaa-Hoppenworth, 48th Ward, Edgewater and Uptown. And I want to thank all of you who are here with us at this moment and also those who might be watching later on for your interest in Chicago's city budget. And what we're talking about today is Mayor Johnson's Protecting Chicago 2026 budget. If you are also inclined, the mayor is also going to be on the north side for a north side budget town hall on Wednesday at Amundsen at 6 p.m. And also you can fill out our budget survey, which Audrey is going to share into the chat. And we've also shared that in our newsletter this week, and you can find that on our website as well. And because we know that budgets can feel overwhelming, and what I want you to know is that I feel that budgets truly are reflective of our values, of our values in the 48th Ward, and truly of the city once we pass it. And it should show and reflect what we choose to invest in, who we're truly protecting, and the kind of city that we want to live in. So today, I thank you for being here, for coming with an open mind so that we can walk through the budget. And I know that you've already heard about certain cuts that are being proposed. So please come with your questions and we'll talk through that later. We know that in the 48th Ward and in Chicago, housing affordability is something that's very important to us. Investing in our youth and senior services, our healthcare, including mental health supports, protecting our environment and public safety, all of these things are very important to us. So with all of that, I'm very glad to have Geoffrey Cubbage here from the BGA, Better Government Association, who can walk us through what's in the budget. And then we're going to have time for Q&A afterwards. But please stay in touch with us at the 48th Ward. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Fantastic. Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and try and share screen real quick here. Should pop up. There we go. Everybody see that okay? Got a presentation on screen. Brilliant. Let me go ahead and start that off then. Good evening, everybody, and thank you so much to the Alderwoman for having me here. Very happy to do. I am not quite a 48th Ward resident. I'm off of Broadway and Foster, just a half a block into Matt Martin's ward. So very, very close to y'all, and certainly spend time in and am impacted by all things 48th Ward. I will say Alderwoman Manaa-Hoppenworth is the older person I see the most on the CTA when I use it to get to and from work, which I think always speaks well of one of our elected representatives. So happy to be part of the neighborhood, all that. I'm here from the Better Government Association, which has been around for over 100 years now, in varying forms and figures, doing oversight reporting, journalistic reporting right now in the incarnation that's been for the last decade or two. It has mostly been a newsroom that does investigative reporting on government. We also have a small policy wing. That's me. I'm a part of that. That basically looks at the same issues as the newsroom and talks about what are the policy solutions, how do we turn these things into law, and then also does public outreach and public education on things like city budget, state budget, all of those good things. So here today to talk about the city budget. I do have some prior experience with it. I used to work for Alderman Vasquez over in the 40th Ward, was his legislative person, and did economic development there in the 40th Ward as well. Before that, worked for a number of different folks doing data analysis, oversight reporting. I am a former worker for USAID, which it basically is no more right now. So sort of been a rough year for some of my prior employers, and I am trying not to feel too much like a bad penny, but here we all are. Talking about the budget, we're going to do just a brief overview, budget at a glance, and then we'll go through the different parts of it, the revenues, appropriations, positions, and full-time equivalents. Public safety budget, we always just do a little breakout of that because it is such a large part of the budget and has a lot of impact on folks. And then we'll do Q&A at the end. If as I'm going through, you've got questions and you don't want to lose track of them, feel free to throw them in the chat. When I get done with the last section of the presentation, I'll start with the chat. I'll just go up to the top, scroll down, go through questions that have already been posted there. And then if folks want to raise hands, do the either visual raise hand or the Zoom feature, we can do that as well at the end when we get to Q&A. So real quick, just to frame what we're going to be talking about here tonight, it is going to, by necessity and by time limit, be a pretty broad overview, and we are going to be looking specifically at the budget book, which is the mayoral budget recommendations, the thing that come out every year around this time. And just to give everyone context, what that's going to include is it is going to include appropriations and where they're coming from. So how much money are you allowed to spend and where did that money come from? It's going to include the positions, how many people are working in each title in each department. You can get full-time equivalencies out of the monthly and the hourly positions with a little bit of work, which we've done. And there's also going to be some estimated revenues for our local funds, for money that's here in the city that's not coming as a grant, but that's coming out of actual local revenues. Grants, we don't get a data set for, so it's a little harder to do really detailed analysis of that, but there is a budget. There's an addendum to the budget book called the grant detail where you can get a fair amount of information about those grants. What the budget does not include, what you cannot glean just from the budget document that the mayor presents, is stuff like operational details, how many people are assigned to a specific task force or in a specific area. You're not going to get individual programmatic budgets. Like I can look at the budget and I can see how many tree trimmers and motor truck drivers do we have, but I do not necessarily see what is what is the Department of Streets and Sanitation's budget for tree trimming operations and their plan for how to do it. That's not going to be in there. It's just going to be the positions, the raw numbers, and I can extrapolate a little from there, but it's not like a programmatic budget for the department or for the individual service that they're providing. It's not going to include vacancies or specific staffing levels. The positions, when we talk about positions in the budget, those are what is budgeted. Those are the positions the department is supposed to be able to hire within the year. It doesn't necessarily mean they have hired them or that in some cases they will hire them. And you don't usually get much detail on actual spend. The budget book lately has included prior year actuals, the last full year at like the individual appropriation level. It said this is how much we spent on this back in this case 2024, but it's not usually provided as a data set. That's something you have to FOIA, which we did, and there will be a couple slides with data from that too, just to give a little broader context. But that's the budget book at a glance. And then here's this year's actual proposal at a glance. So this is the top level numbers from the budget that Mayor Johnson put forward. You can see up there, appropriations are down a little from the previous year. Positions and full-time equivalents are down a little bit from the previous year. Local fund revenues are actually up a little bit. It's about 6.2% in our estimated revenues, not counting grants. So you can see we're appropriating a little less. We're hoping to take in a little more, and then grants will put a little more weight on that scale as well. And we're going to get into some detail at the overview level of how all this breaks down. If there's a specific department or like a specific program within a department that you're really interested in, bettergov.org, our website does do, we call them the departmental snapshots. It is a breakdown of each individual department, and we do them all from CPD, which is the largest, all the way down to the Liquor License Appeal Commission, all 2 of their staff members, bless their hearts. So that is out there if you want to dive deeper into any of the individual departments that we're not going to get so much detail on tonight. So with that context set, a little bit of framing for everyone, we're going to start with the revenues. Where's the money coming from? These are the funds. These are pots of money. So the budget, every appropriation in the budget, which is essentially, think of it as a line item. It just describes what the money can be spent on. Every single one of those is associated with a fund. It says it's coming from this pot of money. Your corporate fund is your biggest one, and it is your most fungible one. It is the city's general fund. Broadly speaking, $1 in the corporate fund can go to pretty much any purpose. You can spend it one place, you can spend it another. That's not true of your other ones up there. The airport funds, those have to stay within the airports. The water and sewer fund primarily stay within DWM. They can be spent on anything that sort of touches on those purposes. So CDOT gets a piece of them. The airports funds go a little bit towards some policing things because there are police assigned to the airports. So there's a little bit of flexibility in those other funds, but not like the corporate fund. The corporate fund is really your most general purpose pot of money. And as you can see, it's also the biggest pot of money. We don't need to go into every single one of these, but this is where the money is coming from that's going into those funds. This is the revenue sources that are feeding those different pots of monies. It's got some color coding up there for when we do sort of deeper dives on some of this stuff. So I think the biggest thing to keep in mind for tonight is the red bars are corporate fund. That is revenues that are going into the corporate fund. They're funding the city's general purposes and can go pretty much anywhere. The biggest bar up top, that rates and charges, those are airport rates and charges specifically. So that fund pretty much just stays within O'Hare and Midway. It's not going anywhere else. And the green fund, or the green bars up there, those are funds that are primarily servicing debt. And that's important to note, because when you think about your property tax levy, which for a lot of people is the biggest city tax you are going to be paying, that's not going toward operations anymore. It really, for a number of years now, has primarily, and in the last couple of years in this budget, entirely is going toward pension debt and bond debt. So it is paying for things that have already happened. It's not paying for the day-to-day operations, which is why you end up with other revenues that have to sort of be cobbled together to pay the ongoing operations of the city. And the first and biggest of those this year is that lease of personal property. That's the computing tax, essentially. That's software as a service, that's cloud, that's your data centers. It's a bunch of different stuff that falls under that heading, but it is a revenue source that the city has raised a number of times in recent years. That levy has gone up quite a bit over the last couple of budget cycles that we've gone through, to the point that it is now the biggest single source of revenue coming into the corporate fund, bigger even than our share of the state income tax. And then this is, again, we don't have to go into every single one of them, but these are the total numbers that are estimated to come in. And this next slide that we're going to look at is going to give you the change in the ones that saw the most change. So from last year, what are our biggest changes in anticipated revenue? Again, that lease personal property right up there at the top, right? That went up a lot because we raised the tax on it. We are charging more, we are making more. Proceeds and transfers in, that second largest increase, that is a somewhat vague title. You know, the name is not very descriptive. We found out at the Office of Budget and Management hearing, alders asked about this, and we found out that that is debt. That is money that is being borrowed to pay back pay to the firefighters for a contract that got approved this year that would have covered the past several years. So there's back pay associated with it, and to pay settlements, legal settlements that the city owes and has to pay. So the city this year is planning on borrowing $166 million in short term. They're planning to pay it off within a couple of years, but to cover those, which for anyone who's done budgeting stuff for any sort of operation, public or private, you know that is a little bit of a red flag. You don't typically want to borrow money to take on debt for ongoing operations. If you take on debt, you want it to be for something physical, something durable, something lasting. You know, a bridge, sure, you take on the debt now, people will still be using that bridge 30 years from now. Raises for firefighters, settlements for legal things that have already been decided, that's not something we're all going to be seeing benefit from next year and next decade and onward forward. So a little bit of a red flag there. The other most interesting one on the revenue changes increases, that orange bar up there, the community safety surcharge, that's completely new. That is a brand new pot of money, and it is a brand new, well, sort of brand new tax to raise it. That is the corporate head tax that Mayor Johnson has proposed. So that would be a tax levied per employee on employers within the city of Chicago that have 100 or more employees. They're anticipating 100 million for that. The city had one of these for a number of years. Rahm Emanuel got rid of it in one of his earliest budgets. I don't remember if it was 2014 or 2015, but he got rid of it fairly early on. And now the mayor is proposing bringing it back at a different level to fund this community safety fund. And there's going to be a slide a little further down that breaks down exactly where that fund is slated to go this year. On the other side of this, on the revenues that we are not expecting much from this year, the biggest one there, the intergovernmental funds, the largest pot of that, the biggest transfers that we saw and counted on last year was from CTA, or excuse me, from CPS, the Chicago Public School System. If you've been following the news, you may have known there was some disagreement about whether or not we were going to get money from the Chicago Public School System. Rather than go through that again for purposes of budgeting, they just didn't count on it this year. And the budget chair has said pretty clearly during some of the hearings that he is not going to see any kind of money from CPS put into the budget unless it has already been passed and there is a signed, sealed, and delivered act from CPS saying, yes, the city is going to get that money. So that's why that number has gone down quite a bit. And the second to bottom one over there, the advance payments, these are things that Mayor Lightfoot started doing. This is, we have to pay a certain amount into our pension funds every year. There is a state law that governs and sets how much we have to pay in. Starting under Lightfoot, we've been paying a little more. We've basically been paying down more of that debt than we have to, which is good for our bond rating. It's good for getting out of that debt quicker and paying less interest over time on it. This year, we are still making those payments, but they've been shrunk. We're paying between 50 to 33% less on them, depending on which of the pension funds you're looking at. So that's why that bar shrunk. And those are just the biggest changes. Obviously, there's lots more revenue sources, but these are the ones that attract the most attention in this year's budget because they've undergone the most change. New revenues, things that are brand new proposed in this budget. The biggest one, again, that community safety fund that is being raised from, they call it the community safety surcharge, but it's the corporate head tax. And you can see after that, they drop off pretty significantly in terms of size and how big of a piece of the puzzle they are. Online sports wagering is the next biggest at about 26 million, hemp tax down to 10, and then you're really getting in much smaller numbers pretty quickly from there. There is also, you may have seen in the mayor's address or in some of the media coverage, they're proposing a new social media tax. That would be new revenue, but it's being done under an existing tax. They would use the framework of the amusement tax that we already levy. They would just apply it to different companies. So that's why doesn't have its own line up there, but it is functionally a pretty new source of revenue. It's a thing the city has not done before, trying to tax social media companies. And this last one I put up, just to give us a little bit of context, these are local funds. This is not counting our grants. And the ones that are up there are the ones where there's a negative anticipation, essentially. We are estimating a certain amount of revenue, and we are planning to spend more than that amount of revenue. Doesn't mean the budget as a whole is imbalanced, right? There's already money in some of these funds. They're not starting at a zero balance on January 1, and there's grants that aren't in this. But I flag it and I put the chart up just so that we do have in mind this year, from its local revenues, the city is planning to spend more than it raises. And you can't do that forever, right? That is not something that is ultimately long-term sustainable. So it is something to keep an eye on as we go into future years. Okay, what are the remaining balances in these funds? What are the revenues we are anticipating going into them? And do we have a plan that eventually means we are spending less than we expect to take in? That's not what we see in these funds this year. So something to keep an eye on going forward. That's where the money's coming from. Appropriations is where the money goes, or where it is allowed to go. We start off with the big picture, and this is a chart that tells a couple of stories. The red part of that is finance general. That's the city's pool of money that's considered citywide, enterprise fund. It's not specific departments. It's not paying for individual departmental appropriations, but it is where we put our pension and our debt. So over time, that's grown a little bit, but as you're looking at this chart, you'll see it didn't really grow much 2011 through 2015. It was growing a tiny bit, but certainly not in keeping with inflation. And that's because we were not paying what we needed to into our pensions. And for many, many years before 2011, this goes back much further than this. 2011 is where the digital data starts, so it's an easy starting place. But for many, many years, the city was paying a flat rate on pensions, not anything that was based on inflation or actuarial tables or anything that would actually kept up with the obligations we were incurring. Starting in 2015 and then going 2017, 2019, 2021, we get into what are called the pension ramps. And then by 2021, we are into what are called the actuarial payments, where the state has said you have to pay an amount of what your pensions are really realistically going to cost you based on the people who've been enrolled in them, how long they're going to live, what their benefit agreements are. We shifted from 2015 to 21 to that. And so ever since 2021, that red bar has gotten a lot bigger. And that's mostly paying down old debt. That's really dealing with decades of underfunding. The portion that is going toward current obligations we are incurring from our current employees is really a very small sliver of that. So that's the first part of the history, is that red bar stayed very small for a while, and now all of a sudden it's getting much bigger. And there is really nothing city council can do about that. That is set by state law, and it needed to be set by state law to bring us back on course to hopefully be where we need to be with our pensions by like the middle of this century. That's what's happening now. And we've only had a couple of years of that. That really only started in 2021. It's now 2025. So we've had 3 or 4 years of playing catch up, and we have many, many more years ahead of us. The other thing that happens on this chart is 2021, and then especially the couple of years after 2021, the other part of the chart gets bigger. The blue bar grows, and that's because the departmental appropriations get suddenly much, much larger as COVID-19 relief funds come in. And now those funds are being spent down. We're not really anticipating much more help from the federal government for a variety of reasons. So you can see the blue bar starting to shrink, and that's a trend you can realistically expect to consider. So the Alderwoman and all of her colleagues are in this situation where the part of the budget over which they have little to no control is going to continue to grow. And the part of the budget over which they have less control, or over which they have more control and more fungibility, is going to continue to shrink. So that is the thing that they are wrestling with this year and will continue to many years in the future. Over on the right hand are just some annual rates of change broken down different way, inflation adjusted or not. And I know there are a lot of numbers on all these screens. Don't feel like you have to write down or memorize or screenshot all of them. The Alderwoman and her staff have this presentation, can share it with you all afterwards. So we can come back to stuff anytime we need. So real quick, breaking it down by department, this is just the proposed what each department gets. You can see up top, CPD, your largest. And then the next couple down after that, CDOT and Department of Aviation, those are primarily grant funded or have their own funds or both. So CFD, the fire department, is your next largest. It's really a big corporate funded one. So CPD, fire department, and then DFS or 2FM and AIS are sort of your biggest corporate funded ones. And then your other big ones are CDOT, DOA, and Department of Water Management and DFSS that are mostly grant funded or have their own funds. Looking at this in a couple of different ways, helpful to remember who is locally funded, who is mostly grant funded, right? When we talk about, oh, we're making cuts, where are we making cuts? Why are we making cuts? Cuts to a corporate fund, those can be spent somewhere else. Cuts to a grant or cuts to a local dedicated fund, less ability to move that around. So this is just a chart showing you how much is the corporate fund, how much is other local funds, and how much is grant funded. Again, don't feel like you have to digest the whole thing right now, but it gives you a snapshot of what your biggest departments are in terms of corporate funding and what are your biggest grant reliant departments. Slightly different way of looking at the same thing. This is departmental budgets broken down 3 different ways. First one, sort of on the top, it's left on my screen, the one where it's total departmental budgets. CPD, the biggest, CDOT, the next biggest, Department of Aviation, the third biggest. If you take grants out, if you look at just locally funded, that's the one over on the right, all of a sudden CDOT's gone because it's primarily grant funded. So it drops out of the top 5 or 6 departments entirely. Now CPD and Department of Aviation are your biggest, followed by Chicago Fire Department. If you take out the ones that are funded by other local funds, specialty funds, and you just look at the corporate fund, your most fungible pot of money, now all of a sudden Chicago Police Department, 50% of what you really have discretionary control over, Chicago Fire Department, 18%, and on downwards from there. So it does matter what fund departments rely on when you think about how much we can move the money around. Net changes this year, so this is the total dollar amount. They go up, they go down. Department of Water Management with some very large grants for storm relief down on the south side. The largest increase net. Department of Aviation, airport revenues are up, they go up. The biggest corporate funded one, or at least somewhat corporate funded one, is Department of Environment. This year's budget proposes a big expansion. That's a department that's been around in sort of a preliminary form for a couple of years. This is the first year it's really sort of taking on its full suite of responsibilities and a full budget to go with it. So it sees the biggest jump. Down at the bottom, the ones that are seeing the biggest cut, those are all grant funded departments, pretty much. That's CDPH, your Department of Public Health, Family and Sports Services, Department of Transportation, Department of Housing, all primarily grant dependent. So there we are getting less money from the federal government. To a great extent, we're getting less money from the state. Those are taking the cuts because that's the pools of money they were relying on. It's really not until you get down to FFM, AIS, that's Fleet and Facility Management. That's your first big corporate funded department where you see a big cut. And then just looking at it as a percent of budget, mostly the same. Mayor's Office for Persons with Disability comes into the ones taking the biggest cut just because it has a fairly small budget. So losing some funding works out to a pretty large cut. I took the Department of Environment off this chart because it's like a 2,000% increase, so it would blow the chart up entirely. But this is your percentage increases rather than net increases. In terms of actual spend, we FOIA'd some data sets to be able to get this. Like I said, they do it at the appropriation level in just like the printed PDF, but to be able to sort of move the numbers around, you got to do a FOIA to the Department of Finance. But overall, city is spending about 86 to 87% of its budget year to year. And by and large, that comes from departments spending a little less than is budgeted. This is 2024. This is the most recent full year for which there are actuals. You can see up at the top there, 3 departments that went over their budgets: Chicago Police Department, Chicago Fire Department, and the Chicago Commission for Human Relations. Differing amounts. So this is how much they went over by in the last 3 years. You can see Chicago Police Department is the only one that has gone over budget in all of the last 3 years, and it's gone over budget by a lot, and it's gone over budget by an increasing lot, from 20 million in 2022 to 188.1 million in 2024. And for the sake of context and scale, that is bigger than most departments' budgets. Like, the overspend is larger than all but 6 or 7 of your biggest departments. So it is an enormous amount of overspend. Chicago Fire, somewhat less with 22 million, and then CCHR's basically vanishes down there at the bottom. $15,000 of overspend is sort of a rounding error in the scale of the city budget. Still important to note because they are going over budget, but really very tiny compared to those other 2. Because CPD is the only one that went over budget 3 years in a row, we went ahead and broke that down a little further just so you can see where that's coming from. Every single year, those last 3 years, they were over budget on court settlement and medical claims that are not covered by workman's comp, although a fairly small amount there. And then the last 2 years, it's been a lot of overspend in what's called the personal services or personnel services, but Department of Finance calls it personnel services. Don't ask me why. Department of Finance's actuals data does not quite match up to the budgets that the mayor presents, that OBM prepares. They use mostly the same categories, but they will compress some of them together, and that happens with the personnel services. That covers wages and salaries, but it also covers overtime, tuition benefits, uniform allowance, duty availability for police officers. It's 7 or 8 or 9 different appropriations all get compressed into that personnel services. So from the Department of Finance data, we can't 100% tell you, here's why CPD went over budget, here's what they overspent on. Because the Inspector General has a separate data set where they keep track of overtime earned by the CPD, we have a pretty good idea that that's where most of it is coming from. We know that Chicago police officers earned over $300 million of overtime in 2023 and something like 250 or 260 million in 2024, which is well above the 100 million that was budgeted for those years. So we can pretty safely say most of that overspend in personal services is coming from overtime, even if we can't put a perfect exact number on it with the Department of Finance data. All right, moving on to the positions. So now we're talking about individual roles that are budgeted for, your head count. And what we've done for this is we have combined the annual positions with the monthly and hourlies. So if it was hours budgeted, we divided by 2080. If it was months budgeted, we divided by 12 to get you your full-time equivalents, just for the sake of simplicity. Most city positions are full-time annual. There's only a handful of departments that have hourlies, and there's, I don't think, any department where it's the majority. So by and large, we're talking about annual positions, but we did put them all in one just for the sake of simplicity. Chicago Police Department, again, obviously your biggest by far. Employs nearly 3 times as many people as the next largest, which is Fire Department, and on down the chart from there. Here's your net change. This is how many positions were added or cut from each department. Up at the top, Department of Environment, again, expanding, taking on new role. About 25 or so of those positions actually came out of CDPH. They are environmental inspection roles and related positions that are going from CDPH over to environment, but they got some new positions of their own as well. And then, of course, down at the bottom of that chart, you can see the Department of Public and Health losing the most budgeted positions far and away, as they make pretty deep cuts as their pandemic funding expires. And Department of Transportation not that far behind them. Chicago Public Library, highlight that as that's your first one to see really big cuts. That is like a locally funded. They have their own library fund, but it is based on property taxes. It's essentially the city just raises a little extra property tax for libraries and kicks it over to them. So they're the deepest cuts in a department that is not primarily grant dependent. Citywide, here's your vacancies. This is from February through September. This year, the city started doing monthly releases of vacancy data as of the end of the month. So we've been taking that and putting it into a database and, just building that going forward. So hopefully by next year, we'll have 12-month, looks at what positions are vacant and what positions have been vacant for the entire 12-month. For right now, it's just February through September. And again, if you go onto the website and do any of the individual departments, you'll see this sort of breakdown done for each individual department as well. And there they are. There's all the different departments with the vacancies. Up at the top there, Department of Technology and Innovation, having a lot of trouble filling positions and keeping them filled. Board of Ethics, we can maybe cut them a little slack. It's only an 8-person department, so a couple of vacancies fills up a lot of the bar. And then Department of Public Health and Department of Procurement Services are the ones that are really wrestling with a lot of unfilled and persistent vacancies. Down at the bottom, the three at the very bottom that are completely full are also very small departments. And then the Chicago Fire Department is actually doing the best job of keeping positions that are budgeted filled, having people hired for close to as many positions as they had budgeted. Real quick breakdown, diving a little deeper into the public safety. We're not going to get too into the weeds on these, but just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of the 4 public safety service departments as the city thinks of them: the police department, the fire department, your Office of Emergency Management and Communications, and your Office of Public Safety Administration. And that last one was a fairly new department. 2021, I think, was their first year as fully operational. They were in the 2020 budget, but 2021 was their first fully operational year. They were created to sort of centralize services that all the public safety departments use, things like timekeeping, bookkeeping, some of the legal and administrative positions. The theory was to put all of those under one roof and have it serve the other 3 departments rather than each department employing their own people for those roles. You can see, looking at this, public safety budgets are up a little bit this year when you put them all together, even though the city budget overall is down. And most of that is coming from the fire department, which got a new contract, got raises. So that's where a lot of the increase this year comes from. Police department, again, even though it's a fairly small percentage increase, it's your largest department, so that little percentage goes a long way. And OEMC with a small bump, well, OPSA saw some cuts this year, so it all works out to slight increase in public safety overall. And that's just a breakdown by percentage, giving you a little bit of the history, so that you can see the first 2 bars, the teal and the orange, that's finance general and all the other departments. And then the public safety are the remainder of them. Blue is CPD, red is CFD, or yellow OEMC, and the green ones that start showing up in 2020, that's your Office of Public Safety Administration. So it gives you a sense of where they relate to the rest of the budget, how big a pot of money we're talking about that goes to, these 4 departments relative to everything else, and how it's shifted a little over the years. There's the actual spend again, just breaking it down slightly differently, also to give you a sense of scale of, how relatively large CPD, CFD, OEMC, and OPSA's budget are to one another, and then the overspend for CPD and for 1 year for CFD there at the ends in that red color. I throw this one up there. These are the things that are sort of direct public safety programs that are not under those departments. So this is, think of it as your sort of alternative services, your pilot programs, things like that. The city has been sort of dipping its toe in a couple of different ways over the years of public safety services that do not run through what are traditionally thought of as the public safety service departments. So there's been the CARE pilot program, which is the non-police emergency response, that's run by CDPH. There's the gender-based violence services that's run by DFSS, and then there's violence reduction. That's like your street-level violence interrupters and some of the pilots that have been going on around that. That's split between the 2 of them. And you can see from this, the last couple of years that this has been going on, they've budgeted some money for it, and that money has stayed relatively flat, or has shrunk in some cases. So these are programs that are still in pilot phase by and large, and they are still not necessarily citywide, and the budgets that we've seen in the last couple of years have not really given them any runway to ramp up or any more room to expand. And then just for the sake of comparison, I always throw them up there next to the Chicago Police Department budget. So in terms of sort of your alternative responses versus sort of your traditional response, that is the comparison there. It's about roughly 1%, tiny bit more than 1% is what you're spending on that. One last slide, and then we can be into question and answer, which I know you will have lots of. This is just to give some context, both to those alternative response programs we just talked about, and to that corporate head tax public safety fund that we talked about at the top of the presentation. This is where the money from that corporate head tax is slated to go. And the green bars are money that is from that corporate safety fund, and the blue bars are money from other funds. So you break it down by individual appropriation and see how reliant each appropriation is on this new proposed tax. You can see up at the top, those 4 that have $0 from anything else. Right now, the budget relies entirely on that new corporate head tax for youth employment through the Department of Family and Support Services, for violence reduction program through both CDPH and DFSS, and for the gender-based violence services through DFSS. And then you get into the other ones. There is another 3.5 million for CPD wages and salaries that I didn't throw on this chart, because if you put CPD wages on this chart, everything else vanishes into insignificance. But by and large, except for that 3.5 million, this is where, so 96.5 million of the 100 million corporate head tax is slated to go. And if that corporate head tax doesn't happen, or if it changes shape, these are the programs that are most likely to be impacted by that decision. So some relevant context for our sort of public safety alternative universe of things. And there's one more slide, but it is just my contact information for folks who want to screenshot or write that down, and hit me up via email or phone after this. Always happy to answer questions. PGA is a nonprofit. We are here for the community. We love it when people take advantage of our resources. So please, please, please reach out. What I'm going to do now is stop my screen share, hop into the chat where I'm sure there have been some questions which I have not been able to see because I've been presenting. So I will scroll up and take a quick look. Oh, we've got some. Actually, it looks like the chat is not too full of questions, which is great. We have our expectations, we have a link to our snapshots, and we have a request to slow the pace and freeze the slides. So I apologize that I did not do that. But as I said, Alderwoman Hoppenworth and Manaa-Hoppenworth and her team will have the slide deck and can share it out with anyone who wants. And my contact information that we just posted, you're welcome to ping me there and I'll get it to you as well. And there is a recording as well, right? I'll have that afterwards so people can go back and watch as needed. So great, we're already caught up on the chat. So thank you for bearing with me while I did go a little fast. The goal was to leave as much time as possible for Q&A, with the caveat that any really detailed stuff about specific numbers I may have to do through the chair as the alders do it down at the hearings. There may be some questions that I have to promise to email the detailed answers to the alderwoman and her team. But with that said, I see Roberto has had the hand up for a while. Was there a question beyond asking me to have some mercy and slow down, which I apologize for not seeing sooner?
No worries. I appreciate that. I have a lot of questions. Can we go back to the slide with the 3 pie charts and can you just dive into that and explain a little bit more about what those 3 pie charts? And then once we cover that, I'll ask my next 2 questions.
You betcha. Here we go. So this is your department budgets as a share of the whole. And it is 3 different wholes. So the first one is all departmental budget, grant, local fund, everything. If you just add up all the money that is appropriated for all the departments, what is their share of it? That's the one where you've got CPD with 20%, CDOT with 17.8, Department of Aviation with 16.2, and so on down. The next one takes grants out, the local department budget. It's taking all of our local funds. So it's your corporate fund, your airport fund, your sewer and water fund, emergency communications fund, all of the various pots of revenue that the city draws on that are not grants. That's the one where you've got CPD is 31.4, aviation is 14.2, and so on down. But you see CDOT has dropped out of it. DWM has shrunk some. That's because those are grant funded departments. So they're no longer really a big piece of that pot. And then the final one, the one on the bottom, is just the corporate fund. So that's your fungible general fund, the thing that you can pretty much move around as you like. You know, if you spend $1 on Chicago, or if you take $1 away from Chicago Police Department, you can spend it on Chicago Fire Department, vice versa for all of those corporate funded departments. So it is the same breakdown percentage-wise, but for 3 increasingly small and specific pots of money.
Okay, that's helpful. And can you define what grant funds means? Because when you're saying that the second pie chart is taking out all the grants, what does that mean? Can you define grants?
Sure. They come from a lot of different sources. So that's going to be everything from our pandemic relief funds were grants. So that's ARPA, the rental assistance when we still had it, which we don't anymore. So it's all of the pandemic relief things. It is other federal grants, and that's things like we have Superfund cleanup grants that go to Department of Public Health, that are specific for the purpose of cleaning up an area that has been declared a Superfund site. They are community development block grants, which are larger, more general federal fund that can go to a couple of different purposes relating to housing, relating to public health, a couple of other things. The budget does break it down a little further. Like if you go to the grant detail in the budget book, it's going to break down what's federal, what's state, what's local, what's private. And then it'll even go down into what is the specific grant, what agency is it coming from. It doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about like what specific purposes it can be used for, but you at least will know what is the agency it's coming from, what city department is it going from, and from there you can do a little legwork to usually figure out what these things are intended to do.
Great. That's very helpful. I really appreciate that, Jeffrey. And then can you go back to the slide where it showed I think it's the local funds, and it looked like it was running a deficit, and at least it was in the negative, and that seemed alarming.
Here you go.
Yes,
So
this
these
slide.
these are the local funds in which we are making more appropriations than we are anticipating revenue. And the difference, it's ordered from largest to smallest on how much that difference is. So, a couple of them up at the top, fairly large pots of, or fairly large differences going all the way down to, the Controlled Substances Fund, which is almost balanced, but not quite. And again, this is not a sign that the budget is inherently imbalanced or even that these individual funds are imbalanced. They have money in them already from previous years. It's just helpful context to keep in mind that on a lot of our local funds this year, we are planning on spending more than we anticipate taking in.
But wouldn't that be a problem, Jeffrey? Like if I'm reading this correctly, right? Just superficially looking at the Neighborhoods Opportunity Fund, the total estimated revenue is $8 million, but it looks like we're anticipating spending $67 million.
Yep.
And like that seems like a very huge or significant difference. Like,
Yeah,
why
you're
is
reading
that?
that. You're reading that correctly. And there can be, for each of these individual funds, there can be different reasons for them, right? They all have different revenue sources. They all have different reasons they raise money. And some of those are way more subject to change year to year than others, right? Some of them are pretty stable, steady. We roughly know what we're going to get year over year. Some of them can undergo real wild fluctuations depending on markets, depending on natural disasters, right? All kinds of different things that go into them. So seeing a big difference between what you're anticipating to raise and what you're anticipating to spend one year isn't inherently a disaster. It's not automatically like a, oh my God, what are we doing kind of thing. But it is something that we absolutely have to keep an eye on going forward. And if it becomes a pattern over a couple of years, it quickly becomes a problem. One of the, to my mind, flaws with how our budget process works is the budget does not include the current balances of these funds just inherently, like in the budget document. It's something you can find out. It's something you can FOIA or the older people can get from the Office of Budget Management and the Department of Finance, but they don't give you just there in the budget book, here's how much money is currently in the Neighborhoods Opportunity Fund, which would go a long way to putting some of these numbers in context of how big or how small these gaps really are.
Great, thank you. Those are all my questions.
All righty, let me pop out of the share again so I can see all the hands. Let me do Hannah Kroll. You've got a hand up there.
Yeah, so you had that slide of the funds that are going negative. Do you have any idea of how many local funds are not going negative this year? I know that's not quite the appropriate term, but like, is my question clear?
Yeah, it is. To get you the exact, I would need to pull up some spreadsheets or get you that through the chair. But yes, it is easily found out. There is it is possible for me to get that. I think I might ask the alderwoman if I can just share that through her team. But the total list of all the local funds and how much over or under expected revenue they are is definitely, it's something I have. I just have to find it and crop out that particular chunk of data and send it.
Okay,
But yes,
thank you.
it exists and it can be obtained relatively quickly.
Thank you.
Essie, we've got a hand up.
Hi, Jeffrey. Thanks so much. That was a lot of information and I'm digesting. I actually have a question for the Alderwoman. So I am feeling really excited about the community safety surcharge and the, revenue stream that will bring in for really important services. I know, Lenny, you have been supportive of that as well. I wonder, I also know there's been a letter going around signed by a number of the council members, essentially trying to kill the corporate head tax. And I wonder, Lenny, how you're talking with your fellow alder people about this, how you're trying to push them to support the community safety surcharge as something that's really vital for our community.
Thanks, Essie. I have to say that if they don't want the head tax, what is the alternative? And so I know that on Friday and on Monday, we're going to be talking about the Ernst & Young report that came out for efficiencies, and we'll get a chance to ask questions about that, because if there's more in there that isn't already in the budget, I would like to know, because if we don't have the head tax, where is that money going to come from? Do you have any thoughts about that, Jeffrey? I mean, the other thing is that we just have to continue to talk about the services that we want to see, not only in this ward, the 48th ward, but across Chicago. And so that's why we're asking people to come to this meeting, to come to the mayor's town hall that he's having on Wednesday, and to fill out that survey so that we can have that feedback. Jeffrey, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that this sort of puts its finger on a bigger problem that, like I said on that slide about, the pot of money that you don't have control over keeps getting bigger, and the pot that you have some control over keeps getting smaller. That's true to some extent on the revenue side too, right? The city has tapped its easy revenue sources that it can pretty much expect a constant stream from in a predictable way. They've mostly done those. And corporate head tax is an attempt to add another one of those that they used to have for a number of years before Rahm Emanuel got rid of it. I actually saw John Lee. I did see there was the question marks in the chat there as well about foreign fire insurance fund, which is another good example. The city has for many years had to kind of cobble together lots of tiny little revenues of what can we tax under home rule, which is the division between what are the things the state has the authority to set under law versus what can the city unilaterally, without approval from Springfield, do. Foreign fire insurance tax was one of those weird little ones that they were able to do under home rule. It is literally a tax, I think it's 2%, on insurance premiums from fire insurers that are not located. I think it's in Chicago. It might be in the state of no, it's home rules. It's got to be in Chicago. Is if you provide fire insurance to a business in Chicago, but you, the insurer, are not located in Chicago, we tax that premium 2%. It is a tiny little pot of revenue, but it's a thing the city could do. So at some point it did it. And there are a lot of these scattered throughout the revenues that weren't big enough to make it onto the screen, right? They're not our largest pot of money. They didn't undergo the biggest shifts this year, but we cobbled together a lot of them year over year to make revenues work. The head tax would be a pretty big one. It would be a pretty significant pot of money. $100 million is a lot, even in the context of a multiple billion-dollar budget. So it's definitely a more ambitious proposal than some of the other things that have been used over the years. But we're also in a position where we need more ambitious revenues, and there are really limited tools that the city can do unilaterally without going down to Springfield. Older people have certainly brought up in hearings, and other groups have written about, including the Better Government Association, in the interest of transparency, have written about things you could ask Springfield for, and how it might be helpful to have more of an organized strategy and maybe a little more push from both the mayor and city council on what we really need and what we as a unified city are asking Springfield for. It would be great, I think, to see a little more cohesion on that sometimes. But in the meantime, you do what you can under home rule, and that's certainly, the head tax is certainly a part of that. The follow-up, I'll just do it real quick because it's in the chat there, about what percent of the head tax revenues are expected to go toward paying down pension. Currently, they're not. Let me see if I can get back into, I closed the presentation out, but I'll get back to that slide real quick that shows how it all breaks down. But it was not going toward pension. The head tax is going toward those sort of alternative policing or alternative public safety response things, toward youth employment, and a couple other things. I'll get the slide back up in a second when I can, just so that everyone can see that. But in the meantime, I see Phil's got a hand up, so let me get that question while I'm pulling the presentation back up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess this may also be for Alderperson Lenny as well. In terms of the toolbox for tax revenue with the city, is there already a vacant lot tax for lots that are just not being developed at all for multiple years on end? And is there a way to, if so, is there a way to maybe increase that tax so it's not sort of a cost saving measure on companies or individuals that are just holding on to vacant lots around Chicago and just sitting on it waiting for a developer or some other opportunity to come up?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. We don't have as many I do support a vacant lot tax. We don't have as many in the 48th ward as others do. Um, and so, but the vacant lots that we have, they're like a missing tooth on the street, and it doesn't contribute to economic development or safety in our wards, and often it just becomes a garbage can. So we do want to do more towards that end. So if you have folks who are interested in that topic, I welcome that conversation. Mhm.
And the question of whether or not the city can do it unilaterally is an interesting one, to which I have heard different answers. Ralph Martier from the CTBA, who I respect a great deal, just saw him do a presentation last week where he said, absolutely, city can do it unilaterally. I've heard from other people in this world reasons why that might not be true. I myself, when I've talked about it as a revenue option, we usually talk about it as there are some distinctions to be made between, are you doing this as a tax or are you doing this as a fee? Those have different legal frameworks, and they also have different impacts on what you can spend the money on. It going into the general revenue pot versus it being something that can only be used to pay for specific programs that are tied basically to the thing you are charging for. So there's a couple of different structures it can look like, some of which would be easier to do under home rule than others. But that's just a little context for that. I saw real quick, I do see Nolan's hand, and I'll get there in a second, but in the chat we had the question on the Ernst & Young budget report. I don't know if that was for me or for the Alderwoman. For my part, certainly, I think the Ernst & Young report is actually, there's a lot of good stuff in it, and then there's a lot of stuff that's going to be saying similar things to what we've been saying tonight here, which is that the problems the city have is that it doesn't have a ton of control over its expenses, and it has a limited number of revenues it can raise. And the Ernst & Young tries to come up with some creative solutions to that, but it's basically a 100-page document grappling with this same big problem of there are a lot of revenues that are going up and are going to continue going up that are set there by Springfield or by forces beyond your control, and you have a limited toolkit to address it. So here are the tools that a bunch of really smart people have come up with that could potentially address it, all of which have externalities, have downsides, both practical and political. So what gets used from it eventually versus what not, I think is going to be more of a political decision than a fiscal one at the end of the day, because there's nothing in there that doesn't come with some sort of pain or discomfort for some people who are paying taxes and fees to live here in the city of Chicago. But it's a good document. It's worth taking a look through. It is a lot of real creative ways of wrestling with a big problem. I don't know, Alderwoman, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. So my understanding, it's a 100-page report that was released to the public already, and I have yet to deep dive into it, honestly. That is the reason why I welcome a hearing on Friday, and if needed, a special city council meeting on Monday. But my understanding is that the budget as it is incorporates, $200 million in savings, and also includes $80 million of those savings from the recommendations from that report. So if you all are interested in deep diving, let me know. I'd love to bring your questions to City Council on Friday or on Monday.
And it is on the OBM, Office of Budget Management webpage. I'm not sure where you'll find it. It'll be like under budget publications or something like that, but it is available on the Office of Budget Management webpage. Oh, thank you. And a 5-minute flag. And I know we still have Nolan. You had a hand up, and I answered one question and then it turned into another. So please go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you all for having this tonight. It's been super informative. I kind of have a two-part question. When you were showing those revenue streams earlier, I think property taxes, you might have mentioned, Jeffrey, that those were one of the revenue streams that were all going, if I'm not mistaken, to debt. Did you say that?
Yeah, that's correct. So your property tax levy in this budget, and this was true last year, and to a great extent, I don't want to speak in absolutes here, but by and large, that has been true for a number of years now, that the property tax levy that we pay to the city of Chicago, the city of Chicago's share of that rather, has been budgeted for pension and bond debt. It's both. It goes to a couple of different funds which pay respectively pension and bond debt. So
Okay.
your property tax does not go toward day-to-day operations this year at all. It has no relation to the operational budgets.
So building off of that, then I'm also like extremely supportive of the new revenue proposals that have been put in place, like the corporate head tax. I love the alternative ways of looking at public safety. I love, but I'm wondering if those get stopped, and I hope they don't. But if they do, and if we're trying to fight for other forms of revenue, it's my understanding that we might look at property taxes as like a possible solution. Is it possible? Maybe this is like a legal thing, but why not adjust rates to tax like extremely high value properties, like a mansion tax, or property owners with over a certain number of properties at a higher rate than what most property owners pay? Is that something that's even I moved away from Chicago for a few years. I'm just got back earlier this year, so I'm not as familiar if that's been discussed as a possible option. But can we get property taxes to be more progressive? I guess that's my question.
I think perhaps then in the interim, while you were away, is when that got voted on. There was a referendum that was Bring Chicago Home, and it got defeated at the ballot box. There was an attempt to have a real estate transfer tax, is what that one was for. Was for a progressive real estate transfer tax on the sale of each property, and that got voted down. You'd have to do a similar process for making property taxes scale differently. That would, I think, have to go to either the ballot or be statewide as well. So unfortunately, for if that's the approach that you're seeking, it unfortunately has a really bad track record at the ballot box in Illinois. The attempts to take things that are currently flat rates and make them progressive rates have failed for the income tax at the income tax at the state level, and for the real estate transfer tax at the city level, both by fairly narrow margins. But they keep going up for a vote and unfortunately being shot down. Which again, yeah, in terms of the city's control over things, it does limit it. Again, you're stuck with this flat rate, which has the benefit of predictability, but not much in the way of scalability.
Right. Okay. And Lenny, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, and it was very, I supported the Bring Chicago Home referendum, and I was devastated that it didn't pass. And of course, if Illinois passed the a fair tax way back when, that would probably be helpful. I
Yeah.
I was in Springfield last week with my colleagues because we need better relationships with Springfield. Chicago's the economic engine of Illinois, but we need all of Illinois to support what we're doing in Chicago because that's the way we're structured. And it's going to take a lot of political will and people talking about it, because I think that um there's a lot of special interests that are fighting against something like that, and a reason why we need to keep fighting to have more progressive revenues, and again, we have to work with Springfield to figure out the ways that we can structure our the way that we fund things. I totally agree with you, Nolan. So thank you for bringing it up.
For sure. Thank
I
you.
want to
And
real quick.
I do want to mention that when we were there, I don't think that they were the speaker and the president. Is this being recorded? I don't think that the speaker, the president, really shot down the idea of a mansion tax. So I thought that was interesting. So there are more conversations that need to be had.
Yeah. And real quick, because I saw in the chat, we had one about the control of the expenses and pension obligations. That's by far the biggest. And I do want to stress, I know I've sort of said this before, but I really want to emphasize the vast, vast, vast majority of that is pension debt. It is stuff the city did not pay for decades because there was no state law saying they had to. And who should get the blame for that, and who knew at the time that they were underfunding versus who was just going along, is basically a historical debate at this point. Most of the people involved in those decisions are not in politics anymore. Some of them are no longer with us at all. But the vast, vast, vast chunk of Chicago's problems comes from not paying what we knew we were going to need to pay for pensions for decades, before, Emanuel, certainly Lightfoot, certainly Johnson, right? That's where sort of Chicago finally has to start reckoning with these decades of debt. So yeah, that is the biggest chunk over which we have the least control. Roberto?
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I just wanted to just say, I wanted to thank Alderwoman Lenny Manaa-Hoppenworth for organizing this. Thank you, Jeffrey. This was very helpful. If I can make just a small request, I would appreciate, it would be helpful for me if we can get someone, if Lenny, Alderwoman Lenny could organize a similar town hall with someone from the Office of Budget and Management. I know the mayor's hosting a budget town hall, I think tomorrow or Wednesday or this week. But it would be helpful to have these smaller conversations with the 48th Ward to understand how they're proposing their budget.
Yeah, yeah, we'll see if we can make that happen. I think some representatives from OBM might be there on Wednesday, so do check it out if you can. It's the same time as our PB meeting, so I'm gonna try to make it. But do ask him the questions, ask the mayor because he's gonna be around, and I would encourage everybody to try to do that. Um, and again, I want to thank everyone for your questions and for being open-minded and for continuing to engage with my office. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, Jeffrey. Some things we really didn't get into, like the local funds and how we're um, raising funds or supporting what's the revenue, what's a dedicated revenue stream to support survivors of domestic violence. That is an important thing to me and many in our ward, and so we have to try to figure those things out as well. If you look at that chart, it's through our home share tax, and those funds are dwindling right now. So we have a dedicated tax, but it's not something that's continuous and something that we can count on for a very important thing that we need to do year over year. So anyway, thank you again for all of your support, for coming out, for sharing with your neighbors. And we appreciate you so much. Please keep in touch with our ward office, and we'll see you in the neighborhood. Take care of everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a nice night.